morning, and thank you for joining us for this webinar to discuss an extremely important issue, K-12 education funding in the state of Washington. My name is Amy Anderson. I'm the Government Affairs Director for Education and Workforce at the Association of Washington Business. The format for today's webinar will be as follows. Our guests will provide us background, information, and thoughts on the topic. At any time, you may send questions in, and we will ask those questions as they come up. You should have received a copy of the PowerPoint that our guests will be going through today, and if not, please message us right now and we will get that sent to you. So joining us today is Senator Mark Mullet from 5th Legislative District. Senator Mullet is the ranking minority member on the Financial Institutions and Insurance Committee and serves on the Early Learning and K-12 and Healthcare Committees. Thank you, Senator Mullet, for being with us this morning. We appreciate that. And to start us off, could you give us the summary of your proposal?
Yeah, for sure. So the idea is pretty simple. It's that you make the current school levies that we have around the state that we vote on every 4 years, that you make those levies permanent. And once you make them permanent, now they're reliable. So you get around that Supreme Court reason of why we shouldn't be paying teachers out of local levy dollars. And the part of the plan that you then have on top of the permanent local levies is we double the amount of state support for property poor districts, because you're acknowledging that every district pays a different rate right now, and so a property poor district has to have a higher local tax rate to support their local schools. And so we're going to acknowledge that by giving them twice as much state support as they currently receive. So, for example, like Yakima School District gets $15 million of extra levy equalization support now, and in this proposal they get $30 million every budget cycle. So that's kind of a simple way. So everything becomes permanent, and then we provide twice as much state support for property poor districts, and then we kind of move forward, and the rough cost of that is around $800 million sort of thing.
And is that the $800 million in this biennium over two?
Yeah, that's over 2 years. We currently spend about $760 million on levy equalization. And the combination of doubling that, and then we're trying to put more money into another support we do for rural districts called Small Schools Factor. And if we increase that by $70 million, which would be a 50% increase, that total is around $830 million bucks, basically, which is obviously very different than the $3.5 billion price tag you keep reading about in the paper. And that $3.5 billion price tag comes from the assumption that we walk away from all the current local levies and we create a brand new state tax to try to replace that and have the state kind of take over more control of the schools. And my approach is much more a local control focused approach, and that's why it's different.
So the $800 million then, that's additional funding, new funding.
Yes.
Ideas on how we take care of that?
So our bill that we dropped to pay for our education plan was the online sales tax, and it's the one revenue source where we can actually get bipartisan support in Olympia. I'm a member of AWB. I own a Zeke's Pizza restaurant and 3 Ben & Jerry's ice cream stores, and I think every brick and mortar business operator in the state of Washington goes a little crazy when they get undercut by an out-of-state person selling items online and not collecting sales tax when we all have to charge sales tax. And that's why this online sales tax bill has really strong bipartisan support, just to make sure we're collecting sales tax from everybody and there's no one kind of skirting our system.
So what else is included in that $800 million additional fee on top of what we're already funding? So teacher salaries, talk about those, per pupil funding.
Yeah. So we had other elements, and we put a floor for starting teachers at $45,000. Surprisingly enough, that's actually not very expensive to do, because even though you always read in the paper that the starting pay for teachers from the state is $35,000 or $36,000, the reality is all these local districts provide extra money for pay, and so most teachers are already above the $45,000 mark. There are some that would get the increase, but it's not the majority. You're at like the 5 or 10% of the teachers would actually have to be bumped up to that $45,000 level. And then we switch to this per pupil funding model idea, and that just creates better equity, I think, between districts. Right now, if you're in a poorer part of the state, chances are you have more staff turnover at your school. If you're in a more affluent part of the state, there's a good chance your teachers stay there longer. And right now, the way we send money out is if you have a more senior staffing mix, you get more money than a school with a younger staffing mix. And the per pupil model corrects for that, basically, because the money's sent out based on the kids not on the age of your workforce, basically.
So one of the questions that has come up around the teacher salaries is, if we're raising the lower level for our beginning teachers, what are we doing at the high end of our seasoned teachers who have been there for quite a while?
And I mean, we kept the state salary allocation model. Our goal was to flatten it so everybody, like in our mind, the beginning teacher goes from 36 to 45. In the model right now, the senior teacher is at 67. So we would move them up towards that 75 rate. But this is what's really unusual about our proposal, I think, is that we're actually giving more money in dollar terms to the younger teachers. So if you think about when we do a 2% cost of living adjustment from the state, you think about if a teacher is making $50,000 a year and they get 2%, that's $1,000. The teacher making $80,000 a year gets 2%, that's $1,600. So every time we do a COLA that's just a percentage, we actually widen that gap between a beginning teacher and a senior teacher. So our attempt is, how do you try to flatten that back in again by really focusing your extra dollars on the early part of their career, where we feel you can get teachers through that first 5 or 6 years. There's a good chance they stay in the profession for the long term.
So going back to the per pupil funding again, not all students have the same circumstances. Yeah. They're not all learning the same way. You may have homeless students, you have highly capable students, special ed students. How is your proposal addressing the additional needs for those students?
That's a great question. So you put in, and to be honest, we kind of copy and pasted this from the Republican proposal that came out like a few weeks ahead of ours. And that's where you put in enhancement boxes based on population. So homeless is an enhancement box. You know, how many kids are on free and reduced lunch is an enhancement box. How many kids are, you know, ELL, English language learners. And so you kind of take all these things that, you know, if your school has a high number of these kids, you need extra resources to teach them because it's harder. And I always say to people, like, I grew up in Tukwila, which has a very challenging student mix. I currently live in Issaquah, where my 4 daughters go now. Those are 2 different populations. Even though they're only 30 minutes apart, you need more money to teach a kid in Tukwila who's coming here, you know, from a foreign country and doesn't understand how to speak English than you do in Issaquah. And so this per pupil model acknowledges that by pushing out more money based on the type of students you have.
Does that also include career and technical education, which has been a real big topic for AWB members? The skills taught in career and tech ed are really the skills that our businesses are looking for today and in the future from their workforce.
And I think that's where, because we completely support that. I know Senator Hobbs and Senator Tacko and myself have been strong proponents of career and technical education. And we kind of said to people, we laid out a foundation, which was the idea of permanent local levies and doubling state support. We acknowledged during the committee hearing, like, there are so many good education ideas, and CTE investments is top of the list of things that we should be doing. We tried to only do what we knew we had the money to pay for, which was through the online sales tax bill. And so we're kind of saying, here's a foundation, we can pay for it. It solves McCleary. All the other education policy we want to put on top of that foundation, let's start talking about it and figure out what that policy is. Because I think there's strong arguments and there's good bipartisan support for having a real substantial investment in CTE this session.
Good. A lot of money. We've been putting a lot of money into the education system over the last few biennium, and accountability becomes a big issue. As we move forward, after you meet the McCleary requirements now, going forward though, how do we ensure that the school districts are able to meet the needs of our students, that we as a state are meeting basic education requirements so that we are not back in this arena again in a few more years?
Well, and that's a great question. I think this is how I view a successful outcome at the end of the session is it's hard to make the stick you take the money away. So you want to push money out to school districts. You want to give them local control of how they spend that money because every district is different. But then if your threat is if you don't meet these objectives, we're going to take the money back, at the end of the day, that ends up harming the kids. And so to me, a good outcome for this session is after this biennium, we put in more money once again, so it'll be 3 budget cycles in a row. We made $1 billion+ investments in K through 12 public education. We then say 4 years from now, if your district is not making progress towards 85% on-time graduation rates from high school, if it's not making progress on closing the achievement gap, so these populations we were just talking about aren't catching up to their peers, well, you're going to lose some of your local control in the sense that if you can't do it locally through your decisions, we're going to come in with some state advice about how you can start to make progress. But we don't take the money away. I think we take the local control away. So I think the ideal vision for me is you send the money out and you give them local flexibility out of the gate. The districts that make bad choices are going to lose some of that local control. I think the majority of the districts will probably make good choices, and they will make progress. Our on-time graduation rate right now is 78%. That's not good enough. I mean, that's the whole reason we're making these investments. If 4 years from now we don't see that number above 80% on its way to 85%, well, we've wasted a bunch of money. That's the reality of it. So I think it's totally fair for us to set a clear benchmark for graduation rates, and districts that aren't progressing towards that benchmark, you know, they're going to have some interventions in their school districts to change outcomes.
Choice in school, a lot of different opportunities for our students to have different learning opportunities. Does your proposal have any impact on that choice in schools, such as charter schools, STEM schools, those types?
Well, I would say I think our proposal is, the way it helps charter schools is our proposal has this idea of there's a guarantee of every district gets at least $11,500 per pupil between state and local funds. And because charter schools aren't allowed to use local funds, we're acknowledging that's unfair. And so we're saying if they're not allowed to get local money, then we as a state have to step in to make sure they get the same per pupil floor that every district across the entire state is getting. And so in my mind, that's how our proposal, it doesn't directly speak to it, but by providing that floor of $11,500 per student, we're basically giving them money they currently don't have in their budgets, and I think that makes them sustainable. I think if this bill were to pass, you would see an interest in other people looking at the charter schools as an option because they know the state's going to make sure that they're compensated for the fact they don't have access to local levy dollars.
So Initiative 1351, reducing class sizes. You, as legislature, have already met that need in K through 3. Right now the unfunded mandate is 4th through 12th grade. And if you look at studies, it shows as the quality of teacher versus the quantity of the students that really makes a difference in education. So making a lot of investment in your plan as well as the other proposals around teacher professional development, recruitment and retention. Your thoughts on 1351 going forward?
I mean, the thoughts are the budget, we're not in a position just to even provide the capacity for K through 3 at the moment. So in my mind, you want to suspend 1351 again. And there are things in there around ratios, around like counselors and things like that in the schools that you could actually implement right away that don't have capacity constraints. But we are not in a position to do what we did in K through 3 in grades 4 through 12. I mean, it's not a realistic expectation. It would have bad outcomes. I firmly believe that. And so I am 100% supporting suspending that initiative for a longer period of time, maybe starting the investments of some of the increased ratios around more guidance counselors in schools, because I think you can do that without building extra schools. And that's kind of my take of how we should move forward. And that'll be politically sensitive of how that issue gets dealt with, but it has to be dealt with this session.
So you're saying suspending, not doing away with?
You could do either. I mean, I think if I'm kind of fall as a moderate in the political spectrum, and I took grief from my own caucus for this education proposal. And when I say suspend, that's me out of the gate acknowledging that's the middle ground of, one idea is you try to fully implement it. The other idea is you completely eliminate it. I honestly think the middle ground solution that'll be the final deal by June 30th is suspending the initiative and trying to move forward on just some of those small pieces that make sense, like the counselors.
So we do have a question. Are rural districts still going to be paying a higher local levy compared to Seattle or Bellevue?
So and that's a totally valid question. They will. And so their levy rate will be higher. But in this proposal, like if you're Yakima and you get an extra $15 million because we doubled state support through levy equalization, Seattle doesn't get a penny. Bellevue doesn't get a penny. Lake Washington doesn't get a penny. My own district, Issaquah, doesn't get a penny. So what we're clearly identifying here is they are paying more at the local level, but they're getting twice as much state support. And we had a whole presentation in education yesterday from the OSPI equivalent director from the state of Massachusetts, and she did an hour-long presentation to our committee, and this is how Massachusetts works. I mean, they have local levies, they're permanent. Like, this idea of having a local levy that has to be reauthorized every 4 years is unique to Washington, doesn't make any sense. And they have different rates, but how they get around that is they provide completely different state support for the school districts, acknowledging that everyone has different property values of how much they can afford to pay locally. So I think we're on the right track of, it's hard to make everyone's rates the same, as we heard from the Massachusetts director yesterday, but you can definitely provide a lot more state support for the people who have lower property value districts.
So in changing that, is that going to require some type of a constitutional amendment?
So this is how our bill has the constitutional amendment, and this is why I always say to people, not a single person in the state of Washington is paying more taxes because of our bill. We don't raise a single property tax level across the entire state, but we make them permanent. And so what happens when you make a tax permanent, instead of every 4 years having to vote on it, it now counts towards that $10 cap we have in terms of property taxes. And so within that $10 cap is a lot of really good things that we do, from local park districts to EMS districts to fire districts. And so those levies that we've always been paying for the last 50 years have always lived outside the $10 cap. The second we make them permanent, they would pivot within the cap unless you have a constitutional amendment saying, listen, these levies can't be raised, no one's taxes are going up, but we need a constitutional amendment to make sure they don't mess up all the local districts who currently live within the $10 cap and squeeze them out. So that's the reason there would be a constitutional amendment. The voters would have to support this plan. They would get a chance to weigh in at the ballot in November around the idea of making levies permanent at the school level so you can actually pay teachers with them.
So we have your plan. We have 5607, 1843, the governor's proposal, and we've just finished a whole first round of cutoffs.
Yeah.
Where are we now as far as moving forward with all these proposals, and where do you see this going?
I think you'll end up with kind of a hybrid mix. I think that my hope is that the plan that we put forward ends up being the foundation. I think, as we discussed earlier around the CTE space, there's a ton of good policy you could put on top of that foundation, and that'll be interesting what that policy ends up being. There's a ton of good accountability measures that should be put on top of that foundation around what happens to schools 4 years from now who aren't making progress on their graduation rates. And in terms of where I think our plan, the advantages it has is the House Democratic plan, it costs $5 billion. We don't have that money. And the plan that came out on the Republican side before ours was a plan where a lot of people were paying a lot more in property taxes. So for half the people in the state of Washington, they had a massive property tax increase, and no money actually flowed into their local schools as a result of that property tax increase. So I think where our plan has an advantage is no one's taxes are going up. All we're doing is making them permanent so we can pay teachers with them. If we don't make them permanent to pay teachers with them, we have to find a new state tax that is permanent so we can pay teachers. And my point is the money's already there. Like, we don't need to create a brand new giant, whether it's a capital gains tax or whatever you want to pick, we don't need that at the moment because the money already exists in the system. All we have to do is make it reliable so we can use it and not violate the Supreme Court.
So thoughts on 1351, I'm sorry, not 1351, the levy cliff.
Yeah.
And having that passed this week. What type of an impact does that have on the negotiations going forward?
I mean, I think the levy cliff is a great example of why local levies are an important part of the solution. I mean, when the levy cliff was put in place way back when, this was, 2010, the idea was the state will be so flush with money by this point that we can pay for these local levies out of the state coffers, So the levy cliff was going to take $350 million out of our public schools. When we put it back in 2010, the thought was, well, the state will just give those schools the $350 million through some new statewide revenue source, and that way the schools don't lose a penny. Well, as we realized here, we don't have, we're not sitting on a bunch of extra money at the state level. And so why would you remove the local school levies that have been voter approved? They can only become law if the voters vote for them, and they've been voter approved. People are trying to support their local school. why would you take that money away and then have Olympia try to create a new statewide tax to replace it? It just doesn't make any sense. The fact that levy cliff passed, I think, is acknowledging how hard it is just for the state to come up with this $350 million that was being lost at the local level, let alone the $3.5 billion that you keep reading in the paper we would need to come up with if we're going to totally take over all their obligations that they currently pay for locally.
So going back a little bit to the levy, we have as a state, we have a very big rural population, and that it tends to be an area where it's difficult to recruit, retain teachers, resources, because you have such a widespread, diverse population. So if we are continuing to require our rural areas to pay higher levy rates, and then adding in the potential of increased B&O taxes and possibility of a capital gains tax, how do we address those issues?
Well, I think that's another great question. I think the main way you say is, if you make the local levies permanent, you don't need that capital gains tax. You don't need the increased B&O tax because you're keeping the revenue streams we currently have intact. So you take all the pressure off of those extra new taxes having to go into effect. And going back to how this proposal works, if you look at a map, this money flows out to rural Washington in droves. I mean, if you go to any school who currently gets small schools factor enhancements, and you say we're going to increase your enhancement by 50%, like they start doing cartwheels. And when you go to a school that gets LEA, and that could be like a school like Pasco who gets 15 million, it could be Spokane who gets 20 million, and you say we're going to double that amount, once again, they're doing cartwheels. So I think as long as their levy rates may be different, but when you really change dynamically how much state support is going to the property poor districts, it offsets a lot of that pain and misery because they end up being able to provide a great high quality education for their students through extra state support, not relying on their local citizens to pay even more taxes than they already are.
So I want to be respectful of your time. Do you have any final thoughts or any other items you want to bring up? On education funding.
No, I think it's going to be a healthy debate. I think the end thing of a good outcome here is we do want to put more resources into schools. We need to pick the buckets where we provide extra investments. Career and technical education is a huge bucket that we have to provide extra investments in this time around. Highly capable is another bucket we don't completely do right. We don't do special education right in terms of how we provide extra state support for kids with special education needs. And so we have to push that money out, but we then have to have the accountability that if you don't start changing outcomes in your local district 4 years from now, there will be a loss of your local control. And I think, to me, that's the outcome of a good, legislative session in 2017. And my guess is that outcome happens fairly close to June 30th. We'll see how it goes. Okay. So.
Well, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you being here, and we appreciate you all joining us. We do have a series of education funding webinars on our website if you'd like to take a look at them, awb.org under the Media tab. Thank you for joining us.